16 or 17 years old, and I was a volunteer for the League for Human Rights at the Brith, which is sort of the ADL of Canada. I remember you coming in to give a talk to us in 1981. So it's like 30 years ago. Anyways, so David is going to speak to us on anti-Zionism at the UN Human Rights Council. David teaches immigration and refugee law at the University of Manitoba in Winnipeg. He's the co-chair of the Canadian Helsinki Watch Group, and he's the legal coordinator for the Canadian section of Amnesty International, and he also has a private practice in refugee, immigration, and human rights law in Winnipeg. He previously was a teacher or lecturer at McGill University. He worked with Amnesty International in various capacities. He held positions with the Canadian Jewish Congress, and he was a special assistant to the Solicitor General of Canada, and he was a law clerk to the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Canada. His education, he studied at the University of Manitoba. He went on to study at Princeton and Oxford, and at Oxford he got his legal education. He's published widely on issues of human rights internationally. He wrote a book with Susan Charnoff about justice delayed Nazi war criminals in Canada. That was a very important book in the Canadian context, looking at how Nazi war criminals immigrated to Canada and to other countries. It was actually a point where this issue, it was sort of becoming a more widely known issue, and David Maness was at the forefront of that, creating that type of awareness. He wrote a book in '89 called The Sanctuary Trial. In 1994, he wrote a book called No More, The Battle Against Human Rights Violations, and so on. He's won many awards recently. He received an honorary PhD. I just read about this at Ben Gurion University. He's won all sorts of awards throughout the world. He's the International Commission of Jurists Walter Topolsky Human Rights Award, the Asian Pacific Human Rights Watch Charitable Trust Guardian of Justice Award, the Brith Canada Presidential Citation, and the list goes on and on. He won an award as Outstanding Achievement from the Province of Manitoba's Association for Rights and Liberties, and also in 1992, the important Governor General's Confederation Award of Canada. So it's really an honor and a privilege, and thank you for schlepping all the way from the middle of Canada to here. And, thank you.
So the subject of my talk is the United Nations Human Rights Council and anti-Zionism. The Human Rights Council was created in 2006. It replaced the Commission, which had existed since the foundation of the United Nations. And it's got a very obvious Israel focus. There are two agenda items on the Council's agenda dealing with country human rights violations. One of those agenda items is on Israel, and the other is on all the other countries of the rest of the world. The Council has a special mechanism dedicated to Israel called the Special Rapporteur on the Situation of Human Rights in the Palestinian territories occupied since 1967. There are other country-specific mechanisms, but this mechanism is the only one that the Council has decided to continue indefinitely. Since its inception in 2006, the Council has had 13 special sessions. 6 of them dealt with Israel, and 7 were directed to all other countries and thematic issues, and no 2 other sessions that had a common country or theme. As of March 2010, from its start in 2006, the Council has passed 33 country resolutions. 27 of them dealt with Israel, condemned, so more than 80% of the resolutions dealt with Israel. There's been no resolutions on China, Syria, Hezbollah, Hamas, Iran, Zimbabwe, Equatorial Guinea, Cuba, Libya, Chechnya. One could go on. There was a resolution on Sudan, but it praised Sudan for its human rights progress. There was a resolution on Somalia, but all it did was offer technical assistance. Besides Israel, only Burma and North Korea were actually criticized in resolutions for their human rights records. Now, the Human Rights Council, as I say, was created in 2006, and it preceded the Commission, which was abolished in 2006. And the Commission also, in its own way, was fixated on Israel. And it was this kind of fixation that led to its abolition and replacement by the Council. The General Assembly resolution, which abolished the Commission and created the Council, said, and I'm quoting for the resolution, the importance of ensuring universality, objectivity, and non-selectivity in the considerations of human rights issues and the elimination of double standards and politicization. Of course, the prime suspect in the charge of politicization was the fixation on Israel. The Commission itself had a similar sort of agenda, one agenda item on Israel and one agenda item on all the other countries in the rest of the world. The Commission also had a disproportionate number of resolutions on Israel, although it wasn't 80%, it was 1/3. But even that was, of course, quite a lot. The Commission also had special sessions in Israel, but way fewer, nowhere near as many as the councils had. So what we've seen is the Commission was abolished because of its double standards, politicization, and it's been replaced by a council which has turned out to be worse than the Commission. With the Commission, Israel was the world's worst human rights violator. With the Council, Israel has become virtually the only human rights violator. Now, if we go back into the history of the Commission and its initiation at the UN, when it started off, the Commission was dealing only with standards and not with countries. And for most of its life, that's what it did. It was just developing human rights standards. It first got into countries with Chile and Pinochet and the coup there. Its second country of focus was South Africa, and third was Israel. The attention that the Commission gave to Israel from the beginning was that it focused on Israel was always disproportionate, but to a certain extent it was at least diluted by intention in other countries. And there were, as time went on, more and more countries that the Commission focused on. But what we see with the Council is a reverse trend. When the Commission was replaced by the Council, the country-focused mechanisms, the rapporteurs, the working groups, the special representatives, and so on, were at least initially carried forward. But over time, in the Council, they're slowly disappearing, leaving Israel more and more isolated. In June 2007, the Special Rapporteur on Belarus and Cuba were discontinued, although there was no noticeable improvement in the human rights record of either to justify continuation. The old Commission had something called the 1503 procedure, and 1503 is the number of resolution of the Economic and Social Council which created the procedure, and it's basically an in-camera or non-public procedure considering human rights violations in particular countries. The countries are listed, but not the considerations themselves are not public. And in March 2007, the Council decided to discontinuation of this procedure for both Uzbekistan and Iran. And again, there was no improvement in the human rights situation of either of these countries that justified its discontinuation. In December 2007, at the time of the genocide in Darfur, the Council ended the mandate of the group of experts on the human rights situation in Darfur. In March 2008, the Council ended the mandate of the independent expert on the Democratic Republic of Congo, despite the awful human rights situation there. So what we have is a kind of more isolated focus in the Council than in the Commission on Israel. Now, the charges of human rights violations in Israel, many of them, in my view, are bogus, phony charges, both in law and fact, and I've written a whole book on the issue, which is called Aftershock, Anti-Zionism, Antisemitism. But I don't want to get into that issue here. The only point I would make here is that one form of discrimination is selective prosecution. And so if, for instance, blacks are prosecuted for murder but not whites, it's no answer to the charge of discrimination that this or that black accused was in fact guilty. Whatever one thinks of the charge of human rights abuses made against Israel, even if you believe them all, the fact that the Jewish state is accused virtually alone has to raise concerns of discrimination. So what's going on here? Why is this happening? Well, one of the innovations we've got with the Human Rights Council is the Universal Periodic Review. And the Universal Periodic Review is something new with the Council, but it presents its own problems. What it does is it reviews the human rights records of all countries in the UN at the pace of 16 countries a session. And the review started in 2008, and the Council has 3 sessions a year. So over 4 years, we get all 192 countries in the UN covered. Now, the review itself is not that great. I've actually been at it a couple times. I go to the Human Rights Council quite regularly. The review is conducted by the Council itself and a working group composed of all member states of the Council. Observer states, that's to say everybody else, can participate in the review. The duration of the review for each country in the working group is 3 hours. The review is an interactive dialogue. During those 3 hours, the subject of reviews responds to interventions. And given the time allotted for the response, and the chair limits interventions to 2 minutes, that means 60 states can fit in. And it didn't take long before gross violators figured out how to game the system. They lined up their friends or those they could bully to register to speak during the 2 hours, chewing up the time with praise or even justification for the violations. And since the pool of potential speakers includes the full UN membership, 3 hours became quickly consumed with organized filibustering. The very label review is misleading because the review produces no evaluation or assessment, no recommendations, observations, or statements of concern. All that happens is that some states make recommendations to the state subject to the review, which the state under consideration can adopt or reject. Now, in isolation, the Universal Periodic Review, I would have to say, is better than nothing, an improvement over what existed in the Commission. But one cannot look at it in isolation because it's become an excuse for the destruction of the standalone country mechanisms. For other countries, they say we do not need a rapporteur on Iran or a working group on the Congo because everything's done in the Universal Periodic Review. And this logic seems to work, sadly, for virtually every country except for Israel and the special mechanism on Israel. Now, we can see what's happening. We can see the distortion, but what's creating the distortion? And it's got to do with the structure of the mechanism. When you're dealing with, I would say, human rights violations generally, what you have to look at is standards or principles, the application of these standards to the facts of the case, and the mechanisms which are in place to apply the standards to the facts. A functioning human rights system would have good principles, good applications, and good mechanisms. And human rights abusers go at all three of them. They distort the standards, they misapply the standards, and they manipulate the mechanisms. And the problem, one can do this in a sort of hierarchical way. And at the top of the hierarchy is the mechanisms, because malfunctioning mechanisms ruin the whole system. I mean, if the functions, if the mechanisms malfunction, then the standards get very easily misstated and misapplied. And that's the problem we have at the UN. We've got, we've got misstated standards, and and misapplied standards, but we have a distorted mechanism. A crooked man walks a crooked mile. Unfair trials produce unjust verdicts. Fraudulent elections lead to bad governance. Poor results are not just a regrettable consequence of poor institutions. Institutions are perverted in order to produce twisted results. The means creates the end. What we've got with the Human Rights Council is, in effect, a Human Rights Violators Council. I mean, the council is deciding on human rights issues the way you would expect Wall Street speculators to decide on financial regulation, the oil industry to decide on environmental controls, or the tobacco industry to decide on advertising restrictions. Now, why is this happening? Well, I think we have to look at how the Human Rights Council is constructed. What's its membership? What's its voting? And in a nutshell, there's a little bit, well, there's more to it than this, but in a nutshell, there's one fact that you should know. The council is controlled by the Organization of Islamic Conference States. Now, when I say they're controlled, I don't mean that they pull the strings behind the scenes or they manipulate it in some way, or they manipulate the members of the council. The control is a lot more direct than that. Because of the zany voting structure of the council, the conference states control now, and have controlled since its inception, the majority of votes. The membership of the council is 47 states. The geographic distribution is Africa 13, Asia 13, Eastern Europe 6, Latin America, the Caribbean 8, and Western Europe another 7. The Organization of Islamic Conference States, after the first election in 2006, had 16 members on the council, with a majority in the Asian region and the African region. Asia 7, Africa 9. These two regions together, counting 26 states, had a majority in the council. Therefore, the OIC controlled the council once there was regional bloc voting, as there is. The story was the same after the 2007 election. 14 states came up for election in 2007. Well, I'm not going to read through all this. I actually, in my written paper, I have every state from the OIC that was defeated or quit, and because there's elections every year. But the bottom line every year is that although there's a turnover in the council and in the membership, every year from 2000, since its inception to the present, the OIC had a majority of members in both the Asian and African bloc. The Asian and African bloc together form a majority of the council, and with bloc voting, it means they control. Now, the fact that the OIC controls the council is itself remarkable. I mean, there are 1.5 Muslims in the planet, but there's 1.5 billion Muslims in the planet, but there's 2 billion Christians. There's no organization of Christian conference states. And even if there were, despite the greater Christian numbers, the odd way the council is constructed would still mean that the organization of Islamic conference states would hold sway. Now, when you think about the way the council is voting, and you look at who's voting, imagine what would happen if instead of there being 57 Islamic states and 1 Jewish state, there were 57 Jewish states and 1 Islamic state. You can get an idea of what the difference might be in the council. Now, the Organization of Islamic Conference States is not, like some intergovernmental organizations, a meeting facilitator. It's an organization with a whole host of positions, not least on Israel. And you can go to the website and see them. The chart of the organization has these provisions. It says, we, the member states, the organization of the Islamic Conference, determined to support the struggle of the Palestinian people who are presently under foreign occupation and to empower them to attain their inalienable rights, including the right to self-determination, and to establish their sovereign state with Al-Quds, al-Sharif, as its capital, while safeguarding its historic and Islamic character and the holy places therein. Al-Quds al-Sharif is the Islamic name for, the Arabic name for Jerusalem. And then it says objectives and principles. Article 1, The objective of the Organization of the Islamic Conference shall be to support and empower the Palestinian people to exercise their right to self-determination, establish a sovereign state without Quds al-Sharif as its capital, while safeguarding its historic and Islamic character as well as the holy places therein. The Charter of the OIC allocates one post of Assistant Secretary General, quote, to the cause of al-Quds al-Sharif in Palestine with the understanding that the state of Palestine shall designate its candidate. And that is the only Assistant Secretary General dedicated to a specific cause. So once the OIC controls the Council, those elements of the Charter of the OIC become the position of the Council. So what we see is that agenda in the Council. But it isn't just the OIC, that the Organization of Islamic Conference, that is voting one way, everybody voting the else, everybody else voting some other way. In fact, we get many other states besides the OIC voting against Israel, particularly other violator states. What's happened is a trade-off. The violator states have negotiated deals with the OIC of immunity from the OIC to their violations in exchange for anti-Israel votes and rhetoric. Because I go to the Council a lot, I sort of know what's going on informally as well as formally. And so one of the things I saw when the Council was just started was Cuba trying to get on the Council. And I didn't talk to the Cubans, but I talked to members of delegations of countries that the Cubans had talked to, because the Cubans were trying to get votes to get onto the Council. And what Cuba was telling to these delegates was, vote for me to be a member of the Council, and I will vote for what you want and say what you want in the Council. Of course, the states, or the delegates, the states that I talked to, said no, they weren't going to do that. But Cuba did get on the Council after having said that to many states. And lo and behold, Cuba is a vitriolic critic of Israel. Indeed, in many of the speeches I've heard, they have focused so much on Israel they forgot to talk about the United States, which is typically their favorite whipping boy. And so what was going on there was payback. The OIC voted for Cuba to get on the Council and eventually abolished the special rapporteur mechanism, which I mentioned. And in turn, Cuba joined the anti-Zionist cause. And Israel has no domestic or geopolitical interest for Cuba. Its interest is only in the context of getting immunity for itself in the Human Rights Council. And unfortunately, what we see, and this is a regrettable feature of a lot of prejudice, discrimination in general, and anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism in particular, is it cannot be contained. You attack one group, you end up attacking other groups. Because every minute spent on Israel in the Human Rights Council, every special session on Israel in the Human Rights Council, every resolution in the Human Rights Council on Israel is time, effort, money not spent on Zimbabwe, on China, on Chechnya, on Sudan, and so on. And so what you have is real victims suffering because of the obsession with Israel. Because if the Council were really doing its work, it would help to focus attention on these serious human rights violations and help to remove the violations. But in fact, that's not happening. Now, within the Organization of Islamic Conference States itself, I mean, there's a wide variety of states, and some of them are at war with Israel, some of them don't recognize Israel, but some of them have trade relations with Israel, they recognize Israel, and they are in relatively good terms. But the problem is that none of them has standing up for the right to self-determination of Jewish people as its first priority. And they too easily go along with those who have an anti-Zionist agenda, because they're part of that bloc, and they just let the people who are the most determined carry the bloc. They're just not prepared to stand up to it. So we've got a real problem here, and the question is what to do about it. Now, some people take the position that the UN Human Rights Council is a lost cause, and we should just forget about it and walk away. But that's not my view. My view is it's broken and we should try to fix it. Whether it can be fixed is perhaps a good question, but I certainly think it's worth the effort. I think we have to remember that the UN human rights system, not only the standards but the mechanisms, were a legacy of the Holocaust, and we owe it to the victims of the Holocaust to keep that legacy alive and not to abandon it. And there's a lot of different ways one can at least pick away at the problem. One of the facets of the problem that makes the matter worse is that there's bloc voting, but Israel's not part of any bloc. So what you've got is Israel, in effect, not being able to participate in the discussions about itself. It's certainly not a member of the Council. As a member state of the UN, it can participate in some of the debates, but it doesn't get into the closed doors where strategies are being discussed and so on. This has been a long-standing problem. The obvious bloc that Israel should form part of is the Asian bloc, because that's where all the Middle Eastern countries are, but the Middle Eastern countries won't have Israel in the Asian bloc. The next possible candidate is WIIOG, the Western European and Others Group. And eventually Israel was allowed into WIIOG in the UN in New York, but it's not allowed into WIIOG in Geneva. And of course the UN Human Rights Council is in Geneva, so that poses a problem. Just this January, Israel became part of Just Hands. Just Hands is Japan, the US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, which is not a bloc, it's kind of a discussion group, but at least it's a step in the right direction. And so one way of at least coming to address this problem, I would suggest, is getting Israel to be part of WIIOG. I've actually tried to speak to members of WIIOG in Geneva to ask to get Israel as part of WIIOG, and I get a variety of responses, but so far it hasn't happened. Another possibility is to end bloc voting. Well, that's easier said than done, because if you look at the resolution that sets up the Human Rights Council, it's set up by blocs. I gave you the numbers before, and those numbers are actually in the General Assembly resolution. The UN Human Rights Council is going through a 5-year review. It started in 2006, so the 5-year review is 2011. It's coming up soon. And there's already states have started. I was in Geneva a month ago, and the people in Geneva said they're starting a working group now amongst the states to look at the Human Rights Council. But I was also in Geneva earlier this year, and I was speaking to some delegates then, and they said, trying to reform the Human Rights Council is not such a good idea, because when we tried to reform the Commission, we made matters worse rather than better. If we try to reform the Council, it's going to be the same problem. It'll be doing everything we can just to keep it the way it is rather than making it worse. So it's not clear, but anyhow, my perspective is at least to think about what we can try that can make things better. And one thing that might make things better is end bloc voting. The trouble with ending bloc voting, though, is that the European Union wants to vote as a bloc because they see that as part of forming or perfecting the Union itself. They want to have a common foreign policy. And so they feel to be true to their ideals of Europe, they should be voting as a bloc. And then, of course, all the other blocs say, well, if Europe's going to vote as a bloc, why can't we vote as a bloc? And so it's a conundrum. I suppose the answer is to stop Europe voting as a bloc, or to get other states to say, well, we don't care if Europe's going to vote as a bloc, we won't. But it's not an easy conundrum to solve. Another solution, in my view, would be trying to pick away at individual states within the Organization of Islamic Conference States. As I say, they're not uniform. And some of them actually, I've talked, of course, also to delegates from these states, and some of them find repugnant this kind of constant parade of anti-Israel stuff, but they go along because they get more grief for not going along than they would from opposing it. But I think there are within that group of 57 states some that could, well, of course not all 57 are part of the council at any one time, but within the group of 16 or 17 or 18 that are part of the council at any one time, some that could potentially be persuaded, and it's certainly worth giving it a try. There are some I guess you could say things that maybe not that easy to do, but are worth at least articulating as desirable goals. One thing I would suggest is changing the voting in the system so that states, I mean, there are states which are members of the UN Human Rights Council, and I read about it in the paper, who don't recognize Israel, and yet they're voting against Israel behavior. Now, this is something that I'm not really going to have much of a chance to elaborate. I mean, why is there all the criticism of Israel? I mean, it's coming from the OIC, but why does the OIC care? I mean, why is the OIC criticizing Israel? And why should the UN? Why spend so much time and energy on this? And the answer to that is that it's a continuation of the attacks on the existence of Israel by other means. This is not an attack on the Israeli human rights record. It's an attack. It's an attempt to delegitimize Israel by making it a pariah state. And there are some states, obviously, who don't recognize Israel. That's what they want, and they go about this voting against Israel not because they disapprove of this or that Israel does. I mean, the last thing these enemy states would want is to make Israel a better functioning state. That's not their aim. Their aim is to destroy Israel, and they do it through a variety of means, but one of them is voting against Israel in the UN Human Rights Council. And so I would suggest one way of dealing with that phenomenon is to say that states who do not recognize other states should not be voting on the human rights records of those states. We could also, of course, try to change the election of states in the Human Rights Council. I mean, it doesn't have to be that the Organization of Islamic Conference States have a majority of the Human Rights Council. I mean, the Asian and African bloc have a majority, but you don't always have to have a majority of OIC states in each of the Asian and African blocs, and so there could be more attention to who the general, or which states the General Assembly elects to the Human Rights Council. I think we could do more to improve the universal periodic review so that it actually functions as an effective human rights mechanism. I think the UN, to a certain extent, is engaged with that because these diplomats do not. Well, I told you that there was this filibustering to fill up the time, and the way that there's been an attempt to overcome it. Well, first to filibuster and then to overcome it, the states have been lining up the mic, and they've been lining up like, if the session starts at 10, they'll get there at 6 in the morning. And diplomats don't like getting up to go there at 6 in the morning. Try to deal with that, and there might be some way of dealing with that filibustering phenomenon. Anyhow, I've got a whole bunch of other recommendations here to deal with the mechanics of the UN Human Rights Council, but I think I'll stop there and just leave it open for questions and comments. There's a problem there's a potential solution, and in my view, we should try to solve the problem. Thank you very much.
So we'll open up for questions. I'll start off by asking you, I think it was just 2 days ago, for the first time in Canadian history, they have not been voted onto the council. Could you explain the implications of that? And I think it's connected to the Organization of Islamic Countries' distaste for Canada's support of Israel, I believe.
Well, yes, could be, of course. Canada lost the vote of the UN for membership in the UN Security Council against Portugal. And of course, when you've got and the vote is in the General Assembly, and you've got a lot of states voting, they're voting for a variety of different motives. For instance, I read a news. India voted against Canada for Portugal, and India didn't give any explanation of it. Didn't even admit it voted that way. They said it's a confidential vote. But the newspaper article said that they had voted that way because Portugal has supported the Indian position that India should be a permanent member of the Security Council and Canada hasn't. So you've got different countries voting for different reasons. But one item that caught my eye was a statement of the Canadian Arab Federation, a public statement which was said, don't give Canada a Security Council seat. It said, and he made a public comment, it's feared if Canada gains a seat in the UN Security Council, it may be used against Arabs and Muslims around the world. So what we've got is, and I should say that Canada has been particularly supportive of Israel under the current government. And I've been to many sessions of UN where Israel is alone or virtually alone in these many resolutions. And Canada, it may get Australia, it may get the United States, it may get Canada in some situations. Well, I shouldn't say the United States because the United States is now a member of the Council, but in the previous, its membership never coincided with Canada. Canada went off, the United States went on. But Australia and Canada sometimes coincided. But I've been to sessions where and Israel, of course, is not a member of the Council. I've been to sessions where the only vote against an anti-Israel resolution is Canada's. And so obviously that caught the attention of the anti-Zionists. And what we've got is a Security Council vote that was influenced by that consideration, amongst others. Now, Security Council is not the Human Rights Council, but it's problematic when you get a membership of the Security Council that is stacked according to those considerations. Because one issue that I know that's a concern to you, Charles, is the issue of Iran. And one of the ways of dealing with Iran is through the International Criminal Court, prosecuting the president, Ahmadinejad, for incitement to genocide. Now, that can happen. Iran is not a party to the Rome Treaty, so the prosecutor in the court cannot take jurisdiction because Iran's a party, because it isn't. The only way that Iran can get before the court is if it's referred to the court by Security Council. Now that's happened to one non-state party, to Sudan. Sudan's not a state party, it's been referred by the Security Council, and now its president is under indictment and a warrant of arrest, al-Bashir. I have wanted the Security Council to refer the case of Ahmadinejad to the International Criminal Court, and I actually went around to the P5, the Permanent Five-Member Security Council in Ottawa, the embassies of Britain, of Russia, of the United States. I'm intending to go to France, haven't done that yet, and I'm definitely not intending to go to China. I won't explain here, but you know. If Canada had got elected to the Security Council, I would have said to them, take this issue to the Security Council. Now I can't. And obviously that's what the Canadian Arab Federation was thinking about as well. And so what we've got is a battle at the UN which is grounded in an attempt to extinguish the rights of Jewish people. And it's a battle, in my view, that should be fought.
Do the proclamations issued by the HRC have teeth? Do they, other than their attempt to delegitimize Israel, what do they mean, considering the fact that most intelligent people know what a fraud this is?
Well, the propaganda has its effect. I mean, obviously has more effect in closed societies than open societies. And so a lot of these tyrannies back home, they feed, they justify their own oppression by defending their country against the enemy, Israel, and so on. I mean, Iran, which is probably the most rabid anti-Zionist state, it justifies a lot of its repression that way. That they're accusing people of being spies of Israel, where all they're doing is not going along with the regime and so on. But you do get problems in Western states as well. For instance, Almog, who's an Israeli general, couldn't get off a plane in Britain because some anti-Zionists had gone to a magistrate and got an arrest warrant for him based on phony charges of war crimes. Or there was an attempt in Belgium to prosecute Shamir through universal jurisdiction. I mean, the whole system in Belgium also, it was based on private prosecution without security screening, so you get these kind of anti-Zionist propagandists trying to prosecute Shamir. There was, I think, Zippy Livni at one time canceled a trip to Britain because of a problem with a fear of a similar problem that General Almog faced. Spain, there's an attempt to invoke universal jurisdiction to deal with some alleged criminals. I mean, it's not just these resolutions in themselves, but what these resolutions do is they mandate other mechanisms. I mean, we have the special rapporteur who used to be Ziegler, and now I'm afraid it's somebody from my old alma mater, Princeton, I should say. But it was the Human Rights Council that mandated the Goldstone Commission. Now, if you look at the mandate's all wrong, and if you look at the report's all wrong. But you have to go back. It comes from a council, which itself is all wrong, which itself comes from the OIC. And then the Goldstone Commission produces all these detailed accusations of war crimes, which then feed into these attempts at prosecution around the world. Or you could look at the General Assembly resolution that referred to the International Criminal Court, the Israel security barrier. I mean, again, the resolution itself was biased. The court, I mean, there was one of the judges, an Egyptian judge, who had already proclaimed on the issue before it got to the court and refused to recuse himself. I mean, the court itself was problematic, the resolution was problematic, but behind it all is the General Assembly, which has this kind of, not as bad as the Council, but still has this anti-Zionist impunity trade-off and dynamic, and it leads to this court judgment, which now international law people say, you know, the wall is illegal, and there's all sorts of statements about why it's illegal that suggest other illegalities in Israel. So I don't think you can say, oh, this is just a bunch of people blowing hot air, let's forget about it. Absolutely not.
Anybody else like to ask a question?
I have a question for you. What action has to be taken based on these resolutions? When these people stand up and say that Israel is in violation of human rights and these votes go through, at that point, what has to happen? What's Israel's obligation? What's the rest of the world's obligation with something like that happen?
I mean, it depends on, you know, every resolution has to be read for its content to determine what action is required. Some of it is just, you know, the resolution setting up the Goldstone Commission. I mean, obviously what had to happen was the Goldstone Commission had to be set up. I mean, there's lots of these investigations, actually, that they mandate the UN to do this, or to look into this, look into that. And, so there's different reports that get generated.
Does it have the authority to force Israel to take action?
Well, there's no international police force. I mean, there's the UN peacekeeping operations, which are set up by the Security Council. The Human Rights Council can't set up, it can't hire policemen. What it does, though, is in order to get a prosecution and conviction, you need police, you need courts, and you need standards. And so what it does is it distorts standards and misapplies the facts. So it creates this kind of background of battleground. And of course, the people who believe in it are not just in Iran. I mean, they're all over. I mean, there's people all over the world that buy into this agenda. And so they use that. It becomes fodder and ammunition to use establishment.
They don't necessarily believe it, but they can use it to justify their actions for maybe doing other things.
Well, I'd like to just caution you there. The first victims of hate propaganda are the people who use it. I would say most people who act anti-Semitically are anti-Semitics, are anti-Semites. They're not just using it for some other purpose.
Yeah, I have just such a short remark in regard to Universal Periodic Review mechanism, which you mentioned. Yesterday I read the final report of the working group for UPR on Iran from 2009. And what was quite shocking, not quite, very shocking to me, was that not once in the whole document, in the whole report, which is actually an official outcome of the whole procedure, there is not once a word anti-Semitism used. So this is also an evidence that not only Islamic countries, but also European Western countries, they lack the courage, I don't know, they lack something to mention anti-Semitism, which is a part of official policy in Iran. So,
yeah, I actually went to the UN Human Rights Council for the Universal Periodic Review Working Group on Iran and Iraq, because I was interested in both. I mean, I went twice. Once it was for Iran and Iraq, and once it was for China. As it turned out, I think Israel and Canada were there when I was there. They were going through the same procedure when I was there by coincidence. But as I mentioned in my talk, if you look at those reports, there's no independent evaluation or assessment. It's just a report of what the states that lined up at the mic at the time happened to say. And then, you know, you see, this is another thing we have to be aware of, that the human rights violators have been ingenious in manipulating the system. I mean, Cuba has been fanatical at gaming the system. I mean, this whole business of lining up at the mics, the filibuster came from Cuba. And I think that the people who are dedicated to the promotion of human rights should show the same intensity of effort and ingenuity as the people intent on violating human rights are doing. And of course, so, you know, once Cuba figured that out, Iran wasn't far behind. So, and Iran is lining up its friends. And so you're getting a report of the debate, and the debate, and who's participating? It's every state that Iran can line up to speak on the issue. And many of them are, their speech is, I'd like to commend Iran for its efforts to promote human rights, and I suggest other countries should emulate its behavior. And I mean, this is the kind of speech that Iran wanted. And then the Universal Periodic Review produces. Now, as I say, you know, in isolation, I mean, if that's all that was going on, better that than nothing. Because better Iran should have to go through the effort and produce a bunch of nonsense and it's patent nonsense, than there be complete silence over the situation in Iran. At least we can see how ridiculous their position is. But the problem is that the Universal Periodic Review is being used as leverage to cut down on the real mechanisms that actually do something.
May I just add something? I found in other reports, for example, on Norway, on Sweden, I guess in Sweden, remarks about anti-Semitism. So, you know, if you compare anti-Semitism, I guess in some Europe, and it was about Hungary and Poland as well. So I think the scale and the level of anti-Semitism in those countries, you cannot compare that. But still, there are countries who want to raise this issue in case of Poland, for example, and they forget to do the same in case of Iran. So.
Well, yeah, I mean...
But I understand the whole political context you're talking about.
There's often an inverse correlation between the seriousness of human rights violations and the manner in which they're reflected in the Human Rights Council. My own view, I mean, if the UN were working in a sensible way, the UN would focus on human rights situations in countries that do not have effective internal mechanisms to deal with human rights violations. Matters should become a matter of international concern only when the national system cannot deal with them. And so, I mean, I wouldn't say that Israel's got a perfect record, but I would say that Israel can deal with its own problems because it's got an independent judiciary, it's got a democratic parliament, it's got an independent judiciary, and there's no need for the international system to deal with Israel, or Sweden, or Norway, or Canada. But there's a big need for the international system to deal with Iran, or China, or Burma, or North Korea, because they internally cannot deal with their problems, and only we who are outside can. But it becomes a reverse. What we see in the UN human rights system is the violators get impunity because of this kind of negotiation, whereas the states that do have effective internal mechanisms end up amongst themselves criticizing each other as a way of setting an example, so that in the hope that the violators will take the system seriously. But of course that doesn't happen, and we just get this perverse, converse result.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. I have two remarks regarding your speech. First of all, I think you mentioned that as a side effect, the real victims suffering of human rights violation are not a subject of the only investigations. Mm-hmm. And I guess this is a very important point, because you have the nations which make the profit of this are mostly the nations who are in charge of blaming Israel for human rights violations. And I guess this must be more put into public discourse. And this is also leading to my second point, that you talked about strategies more in a, I'd say, diplomatic way and something like that. And I guess, you know, Israel is blamed for about, since 75 or something like that, from the UN regarding human rights violations. And in terms of public discourse, you know, it's the opinion of especially in Europe, of the people as that Israel is clearly delegitimizing, you know. That it's and I guess someone has to do, and especially when it comes, it's proven by the UN. The UN has still in Europe has a very good name, still, and if it's got the seal of the UN, it's no one asks about how the result will how this proceeds. And so I guess it's not only on the strategic or diplomatic level where someone should take action, but mainly on the public discourse level.
Yeah, well, I agree with that. And I mean, I'm here, I'm not at the UN.
Yes.
And I speak at a lot of public events, yes. And I've written a book on the issue, and I'm trying to talk everywhere about it as much as I can, and especially in democratic states, they're going to be influenced by their electorate. And the problem isn't just in the tyrannies. As you say, there is all too much in Europe and elsewhere for these points of view, and it's a battle that has to be fought difficult task you can possibly imagine in dealing with anti-Zionism. It's reforming the Human Rights Council. So that's where I gravitate. And different, different people have different approaches. But I would say absolutely you're right.
If I may just add to what Holger was saying, I think standing in the academy, you touch on the internal mechanisms and politics of the United Nations and other international organizations. But we have, in a sense, within the academy and among Western intellectuals, you have a social movement sweeping the Middle East, which is reactionary, which is not only genocidal in its anti-Semitism, it's homophobic, it's sexist, it wants to do away with religious pluralism, it wants to do away with citizenship as we understand it. Everybody in the West believes, whether you're right-wing or left-wing, in being equal under one legal system. So here's a social movement which is diametrically opposed to it. And we have many people in the academy, intellectuals, public intellectuals, who are silent and acquiescing to this challenge to democracy, and in fact paint people who are trying to deal with it, to understand it, as being intellectual, apologists for Zionists. So there's a malaise, I think, even among intellectuals that is, I find extraordinarily disturbing. It's not just the bloc voting. That I can almost understand Iran. I can understand the Organization of Islamic Countries. I can't understand people like Judith Butler, who's a Jewish feminist who is respected all over the world, who will say that Hezbollah and Hamas should be seen as the progressive left. And she's not alone. She's a darling of progressive intellectuals in Europe and in North America. So, from your position, what's going on?
Well, I mean, these of course, are not isolated phenomena. They develop together and they reinforce each other. I mean, it's what's going on is anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, and it manifests itself in different ways in different contexts. In academia, it manifests itself in academic discourse. In the UN, it manifests itself in votes, in resolutions, in special sessions. But where does anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism come from? I mean, well, what you've got is bigotry. Anti-Semitism is it's people who reject others. It's existed since the history of recorded time, since before the history of recorded time. So it does have a new dimension because Israel, of course, it did not exist before 48. So what you see is the old I hate Jews as individuals becoming I hate Jews as a people, which couldn't have existed in before 48 because Jews, the Jewish state did not exist before 48. So what you're seeing, and I would say this is generally true, that perpetrators do not disappear, they just adapt. Violations do not disappear, they just change their form. When I was a child, I was going to school, I was accused by my colleagues in elementary school of killing Christ, which struck me as kind of strange. As a kid, and I thought, how could I have killed somebody who died 2,000 years ago? As an adult, I was a rapporteur of the Jewish Caucus, or Durban, South Africa's World Conference Against Racism. I was accused by people at the conference of killing Palestinian children. Well, to me, this was very similar. I mean, the words were different, but it was basically the same sentiment. And it was both cases because I was Jewish. Killing somebody I didn't kill. And so there's a mutation. The dress changes, the vocabulary changes, but it's basically, and to a certain extent, what you're dealing with is human nature. I mean, hatred is a basic human emotion. It's always been with us and always will be with us. And we're not going to abolish hatred. So we're just going to see it in different guises and forms and vocabulary as the social context and vocabulary shows. not a very
Yeah, I was
optimistic
just gonna say
message.
that.
But I wouldn't say though that there's nothing that can be done about it, because even though I mean there are certain basic problems that are at the foundation of all this, the harm they reap ebbs and flows, and you know it reached its pinnacle with the Holocaust. But we're not now living a Holocaust, and I think we have the capacity to combat the problem. In many ways, much more of a capacity now than we did then, and there are things that can be done, and I certainly do not have a counsel to spare, absolutely not.
I was just going to ask you your opinion. I know the United States is not a member of the commission at this time, but what kind of...
Actually, it is. It wasn't before, but now it is.
Okay, I got it backwards. I'm sorry. What kind of influence does the United States have, or does the United States want to exert on the OIC or the other Western democracies? It may be low on our priority of things we want to accomplish at the UN, but what do you see happening, and has there been any change since our new administration, the Obama administration?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's there. The U.S. was not a member of the OIC. It was not a member of the Human Rights Council under the Bush administration because they didn't want to be. And in theory, even if you're not a member, as an observer state, you can show up and speak, and many do. But the U.S. wouldn't do that. They'd send somebody there, a junior officer, foreign affairs officer, to take notes, and that was it. But because the way the organization, the room is organized, it's member states with their country cards are in the inner circle and all other states in the outer circle. So there is a kind of a desk for the United States. But the junior officer in the Bush administration wouldn't even sit at the desk. She would sit behind the desk in a separate chair, just taking notes. Now, of course, the UN is there and it's participating in the debates. And I met with the U.S. mission